All right, next we'll talk about the High Middle Ages, also known as the Gothic Age, from around 1150 to 1450. So first we'll bring up some important issues of the Gothic period. Um, Overarching all of it is a spiritual and intellectual revival. Many factors came together. It was a confluence of parts that became like a snowball effect that radically changed culture of the Middle Ages and set the stage for the Renaissance. For one thing, the population explodes. More efficient methods of agriculture could feed more people. There was also urbanization. There was a resurgence of cities. Cities were a refuge from the feudal country life, and it made possible a revival of trade. Returning crusaders brought ideas from the East. City life allowed a growing middle class. You could be a merchant or a craftsman, and that allowed for a certain kind of social mobility as opposed to the rigid feudalism that existed before in the country, where if you were born a serf, you would undoubtedly die a serf. There was a sort of bootstrap mentality to this, and this also kind of dovetailed with a growing sense of individualism and humanism in society. Another important influence was strengthening monarchies, as opposed to the small, decentralized feudal kingdoms of the earlier Middle Ages. This allowed for more stability, and that created more economic activity. We also had the birth of the university, which spawned a class of people who sought knowledge. It created demand for classical writings, science, math, etc. And Aristotle was especially popular. And these universities got writings from the Muslims in Spain who had the forethought to actually preserve these writings rather than burn them as pagan heresies. And still, being from the pagan past, Aristotle's work created quite a controversy. St. Thomas Aquinas tried to resolve the controversy. He created a synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian thought. The attitude was that Christianity must come to terms with the concept of Aristotle in order to remain valid. And this brings us to a growing secularism in society. There was a conscientious separation of reason and religion. More and more, these were becoming distinct spheres of influence, unlike the Byzantine East. Certainly not to the degree that we have now, but it was still a significant change that brought about a true liberation of ideas. But just as things were starting to really turn around, the Black Death sweeps across Europe from China, thanks to trade. Dense population centers were the hardest hit. Sorry, cities. As I read this lecture, we ourselves are still in the grip of the coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic that really took hold last spring. Fortunately, the major pandemic of our time hasn't been quite so devastating to us as the Black Death was to people in the 14th century. Not yet, anyway. But with the amount of interaction between cultures in our modern world, just imagine what it would have been like if COVID were even more contagious or life-threatening. My hope is that we can learn from all the mistakes we've made this time around, because I don't think this sort of thing will be an isolated incident. Anyway, in Europe in the late 1300s, the bubonic plague killed a third of the entire continent in 3 years. Just imagine that kind of loss. However, on the plus side, the shortage of workers that resulted from that loss of life amounted to a really significant increase in wages for workers, an increase in quality of life, and more of a reduction of the social stratification that was the hallmark of feudal society. And of course, there were other significant events during this period. As the monarchies became more powerful, the church became weaker in relation. The French king moved the church capital to Avignon in France, and this sort of represented a disorganized and relatively impotent church. The Great Schism of 1378 involved fighting among claimants to the to the papacy. That different people thought that they should be the Pope. This was resolved by 1417, but it resulted in many reforms. We spoke at some length about the Crusades when we were talking about the East and the Byzantine culture. Why did the Crusades happen? The popularity of pilgrimage was one influence that we've talked about the last time. There was also maybe a hope for reconciliation with the East that had been estranged within Christendom. But also mysticism and asceticism were the order of the day. And those kinds of attitudes were ripe for this sort of demonstration of faith, going off to fight and die for your God. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II called for an army of God. People clamored to join up, and there was a naive optimism of what would happen, like in a lot of wars, I suppose. Here you see the routes they took on their way east. The armies sort of lost their moral compass along the way and ended up ravaging places they went through. There was a wholesale slaughter of Jewish people. And then when they got to the Holy Lands, there was this inferiority complex that we talked about a couple weeks ago. When they saw the majesty of the East, they got jealous. But on the plus side, these crusades also made trade routes much more accessible. And this also increased demand for trade upon their return. Spices in particular were important to this trade. There was also the concept of chivalry and the cult of Mary that reflected an increasing influence of femininity in society. Eleanor of Aquitaine set a tone of civility as opposed to the earlier feudal brashness. This was about virtue in battle and courtly love, while the feudal period earlier on fixated on death and damnation. In all of Western Christianity, the emphasis now evolved into a more optimistic religious outlook. It's sort of like the carrot rather than the stick of earlier Middle Ages Christianity, not so focused on fire and brimstone. It was Christ as Savior rather than the judge who'd been tortured. The Virgin Mary became especially popular at this time and took on a dominant role in faith, practically side by side with Jesus. Notre Dame or Notre Dame means Our Lady. The motif repeats many times in Gothic art. Speaking of which, let's talk about this. Let's try to get a handle on what Gothic art means. Gothic began as a derogatory term, mistakenly attributed to the uncouth Goths by later Italian civilized people. The style to them, the style was overly showy or gaudy, and they figured it must have been those ridiculous Goths that were responsible for it before historians really understood where it actually came from. And this style was really dominated in France and Germany and England. The cathedral is probably the best example to look at when trying to define the Gothic style. Cathedrals became the centers of town life at this time. They were the object of civic pride, and each village would try to outdo the others in their cathedral construction. New engineering techniques allowed for taller and taller construction, and sometimes they pushed beyond their limits with catastrophic results. And you can almost point to a starting point with Gothic style. It really begins with Saint Denis. Abbot Suger was responsible for the design, and it featured a wide open interior, and in fact an interior bathed in divine light, which was symbolic of the light of God. A circular string of chapels, by virtue of which the whole would shine with the wonderful and uninterrupted light of most luminous windows pervading the interior beauty. The Gothic style had a lot of regional distinctions, but several things are common, throughout all the different styles. One thing was a lot of vertical. Almost everywhere you look in Gothic architecture, you see these vertical elements. This idea of the line kind of carrying your gaze up to the heavens. We see pointed arches with Gothic cathedrals as opposed to the rounded arches of the Romanesque period. And we also see just this sense of height. Not only were they built as tall as they could possibly build them, as sort of a medieval pissing contest, but they also made them, everything they did, they made it to make it appear as tall as possible. And they also used rib vaulting that we'll talk about in a bit. And it could get relatively complex as these intersections of vaults happened within the cathedral. See, barrel vault is the basic shape, but then when you have barrel vaults crisscrossing one another, it's referred to as a groin vault. Possibly the most indicative architectural feature of Gothic cathedrals was the flying buttress. Flying buttresses were an engineering design to add support in order to make the walls go higher and higher. It also opened up the walls to where you no longer needed to support the structure so much, which allowed for not only an open sense of space inside versus the very bulky walls with the pillars of the Romanesque churches, but also it allowed for stained glass windows. And of course, these stained glass windows were another hallmark of Gothic architecture, symbolizing the mystery of the faith through colorful divine light. Chartres Cathedral is the pinnacle of Gothic architectural style. In fact, it tells the story of the Gothic style because it was built over a span of years. And towers and vertical decoration lead viewers' gaze to the heavens. The mismatched towers, one was earlier, one was later, become increasingly more decorative and more pointy. Chartres is particularly famous for its stained glass windows. Here we can see the rose window of the west facade at Chartres, and you can see the exterior view looking in, and then the view from inside looking out. Wide, a wonderful array of different colors, and every panel tells a story of medieval life. Here's a close-up of the rose window. You can see the intricate designs. Another great example of Gothic architecture is Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. In this interior shot, you can see that the whole structure is practically stained glass window with an overwhelming sense of light. So there were major developments in Gothic sculpture and painting as well. And these, along with the architecture, are sort of cataloged in the construction of Chartres Cathedral, from earlier in the construction until later on. In these jam statues, we see that sculpture is still attached to the cathedral architecture, but took on much more naturalism. There was a relaxing of rules. Figures could become a little more lifelike, and they began to step away from their backgrounds. This was a little bit closer to true in-the-round sculpture, and it was influenced by a renewed interest in the classical tradition of the ancient Greeks. And as I said, the Chartres Cathedral in particular, the sculptures there illustrate the changes that European sculpture went through during this time period. Two pretty distinct styles. So earlier in the Gothic period, the West Portal Jam statues from 1140 to 1150, 1170, something like that. We start to see individual identities in the figures, unlike in earlier medieval figurative art. And they begin to suggest the figure beneath the clothing. They're still somewhat rigid, but much more lifelike than earlier on. And then in the South Transept Portal Jam statues from 1215 to 1220, we really see the high Gothic style or the Gothic classicism. These sculptures are even more lifelike, and they stand more apart from the columns that they decorate. There's even a subtle contrapposto you can see in the figure on the far left. This is when naturalism in figurative depiction really starts to take hold in Western part of Europe. And this is the most we've seen of anything like this since the classical era with the Greeks and the Romans. And now let's talk about Gothic painting. The Renaissance, which we'll talk about next week, will be what will be called the Age of Painting. But Gothic developments are really what paves the way for that. We see the beginning of three-dimensionality, kind of like what we saw with the developments in sculpture. And we see a break from the flat two-dimensional world. We see mobility and begin to see life in the figures. And we begin to see individually depicted characters and not just types or stereotypes. By the end of the 1200s, there was a burst of activity. The Byzantine style had been popular, but changes very soon were coming. We'll look at three important painters in particular. Two of them were great Byzantine-style painters of the Gothic era. The third one was possibly the most important painter in history. First up, Cimabue. Here is the Madonna Enthroned from around 1280, 1290. We see this upward striving monumentality, and along with the veneration of the Virgin Mary, we talked about that a little bit ago, with the Christ child on her lap. But you could see that the baby Jesus there has, like a lot of the medieval painting depictions, looks like an older person, almost like an old man on a baby's body. This painting was done in the medium of tempera, which involves suspending the pigment in an egg yolk substance. And it also involved the application of gold leaf, which, similar to the Byzantine mosaic look that we've seen earlier. This is a large scale panel, around 12.5 by 7 feet. Then along comes Duccio. And Duccio institutes big changes in painting. Here is Madonna Enthroned, 1308, 1311-ish. Got a lot of Madonna Enthrones. Duccio softens this 3D look to the figures. The figures are enveloped in space rather than pasted on the surface. We even see natural looking fabric, and a bit of emotion starts to make itself seen. You see this kind of tender exchange from mother to child in this painting. This is another section of the Maesta, or Madonna Enthroned. We see with Duccio, in this Gothic tradition, there's still somewhat of an awkward sense of space in the architecture that's depicted, but you can see that painters like Duccio are beginning to make an attempt to create a believability in the setting that the figures of the painting are in. And finally, the third in our list of great Gothic painters is Giotto. And Giotto is really the giant of late medieval painters. In fact, I would go so far as to say he's not even really medieval. I would say that he is perhaps the first Renaissance painter. With Giotto, we see a much more compelling believability in the figures that are painted. He painted effectively from life, and we see a much more pronounced sense of chiaroscuro, or modeling, the illusion of mass. We see the faces, the breasts, the hands, everything just really feels like it exists in physical space. And gone are the Byzantine conventions of stylized depiction. The life of Giotto is legendary. He was actually famous in his day, like perhaps the first like European art star. The legend goes that he was, quote, discovered by Cimabue in a field drawing sheep and became Cimabue's apprentice. It's not entirely clear if this story is true. Here we see a comparison of the same basic picture painted by both of them, and the contrast couldn't be more stark in the sense of believable space and this informal, lifelike quality of Giotto compared to the more rigid, formal, Byzantine flatness of Cimabue. The Arena Chapel from 1305 is Giotto's best known example of his work. It's a massive in scale. It takes the form of these separated panels in this vast interior space. It was commissioned by a wealthy family and included 37 biblical scenes. The most famous of which is the Lamentation on the north wall. In fact, this would be a good candidate for the most, maybe the most important painting in all of Western art history. We see a depiction of the story of Christ after being taken down from the cross, mourned by Mary and others with angels overhead crying out in sadness. This painting is revolutionary in its use of space. The grouping of figures it was simple and coherent. We see them facing in different directions that move our gaze around throughout the composition, and also create a focal point around the image right there where Jesus and Mary are. It also creates a revolutionary sense of space. We see these figures and the two figures sitting in the immediate foreground with their backs turned to us, referencing this volume that exists in the midst of the picture plane. This was also a very human scene. And I brought this up a couple slides ago, but we see with Giotto like a real individual treatment of characters. Before this, it was common for people in paintings to look more like a type or kind of cartoony, or kind of more representing the person rather than being a depiction of the person. But with Giotto, we get a much more individualized personality to his figures that he paints. We see this real emotion that he embraces, unlike the more static kind of formal rigidity of the earlier painters. We also see an atmospheric perspective being used to create a sense of depth. All of these things are incredibly revolutionary for the time. Here are a few more detailed shots. And I'll leave this lecture with other shots of the Arena Chapel paintings. We'll see in the next lecture the way that Giotto paves the way for the age of painting, and learn just how influential this artist became. Here's another comparison shot, this time between Giotto and Duccio. And that's it until next time, when we'll tackle the world of the early Renaissance.